Oh, this is for paper one of A-level film studies educas. Now, I will be doing a few videos related to this and splitting them into the films that I cover with my class, but obviously this could be useful for anyone who studies this. Just here on the main screen, I've got what paper one entails for my group. The comparison between Alien and Vertigo, which is what I'm going to focus on today. Get Out and Joker, and then Trainspotting and This Is England. Now, paper two would be Pan's Labyrinth and Parasite, Amy, Silent Films, and Mulholland Drive. Now, obviously, there are several different ways that other teachers may have taught you, and there are also different things that some teachers will have taught you a bit more in depth, and other things which you'll have been expected to look at yourself, or you just may not have come across, because there's a lot of content that you could possibly cover on the A-level film spec, and some of that is going to require your own additional reading. Now, each film area has its own discussion points, so things that they're expecting you to know a lot about for a specific film. But the stuff that's on the left here, and also taken from the specification just on the right, are the kind of things that they could ask for any film. So as it says in their core study areas, key elements of film form, meaning and response, and the context of films. Key elements of film form, there's some on the left here. So mise en scène, so including aesthetics, cinematography, sound and editing, context, performance, and so on. And I've got one at the bottom that's not necessarily explicitly said, but the role of the director, and that can include auteur. So although auteur is a specific study area for some of the films, such as experimental film and the comparison that we're about to go into, auteurism can come up at any point in terms of understanding if the director, a sound designer, an editor, etc., are showing those auteuristic traits and what counts as an auteuristic trait. Okay, so that could be asked on any film, but the rest of it is pretty straightforward. They could ask it on any film, and these are the only areas that could be asked on something like Parasite or Pan's Labyrinth, because there are no specialist areas for those films. Okay, so first of all, I've done a video already comparing Alien and Vertigo, but I wanted to be a bit quicker and sort of quite explicit with it, so you can use it as a bouncing off point for your own studies. Okay, so the focus is auteurism and auteur theory. What is auteurism then? So they're argued to be products of an auteur director, and some questions will ask you to debate the idea. So in a nutshell, and this is a very basic definition, auteurism is a term coined in the 1940s that represents the idea of the director as the major creative force in their film. Okay, that doesn't mean auteurs don't have help from people. That would be ridiculous. But they tend to have complete creative control on what goes on. Now, arguably, if you wanted to be really super simplistic about it, Vertigo is very much an auteur film. Alien, you could argue that so many different people had involvement in it that you may discount the idea of auteur, and instead it's more of a collaboration process. That isn't to say that Ridley Scott isn't an auteur. You know, he is one of the greatest living directors, so it's important to keep that in your mind. So what are auteurisms? So these are like common features for a director's auteur style, almost like their auteur conventions, things that you would find in their own work. So for example, Ridley Scott's visual storytelling would be an auteurism. So I'm going to do a comparison between the two to start off with. So if you look at Scott's auteurisms, he tends to have female-led stories. So you see that in Alien, although it wasn't necessarily written with a female lead, but it was a female-led story, the same way as something like Thelma and Louise is a female-led story. He is quite good about representing women in a positive light, rather than focusing on the industry standard of keeping women as passive objects. He has a heavy use of smoke, and he tends to do this to convey mystery, but there are also moments where it just adds sort of to the mystique of characters, particularly. So it is that level of mystery, but mystique to characters. And also heavy usage of it in his science fiction films, such as Blade Runner. He's got wide landscape shots, so this tends to involve showing off a set piece, which links to the idea of a visual storyteller, right? The use of natural lighting. Now, this doesn't necessarily apply to Alien because he uses a lot of unnatural lighting. So he tends to use like big neons and lots of vibrant light. But most of his films tend to involve a lot of natural lighting. He tries to keep things as realistic as possible. But Alien still comes across with this element of verisimilitude. He tends to have a warning against AI or new technology in his films, or like being skeptical of that new technology and how far it could go. So Blade Runner is a perfect example for this, and also Alien. He also tends to have philosophical questions in his film, questioning the identity of man, questioning where we go with our lives, questioning all these kind of different philosophical questions. And then also he has a huge amount of involvement in screenwriting and control over production. He likes to have involvement in every aspect, and that is because he's also filled a lot of different roles in the film industry, and he knows those roles particularly well. Okay, for Hitchcock, his auteurisms, the male gaze or the Hitchcock blonde is an auteurism of his. He tended to pick certain types of women to play roles in his films, and there have been several allegations that he was quite cruel in some cases to them, or quite creepy. But the use of the male gaze to force women into passivity and objectify women as far as he could objectify women under the Hays Code until that was lifted. So there's visual storytelling in place of dialogue. He famously didn't reject dialogue, but he said that visual is the most important. The visual is the key. It needs to be able to convey the story without telling you it. Use of German Expressionism and the chiaroscuro effect. So German Expressionism is the emphasis of shadow and obviously expressing oneself, which originated in, it's an art movement, but also in terms of film, the silent film era gave a lot of headway to the German Expressionist movement, where you were using sort of stylistic features in order to convey meaning. Non-linear narratives, flashbacks and flash forwards. He uses this sort of this cutaway with Vertigo so we can see things from Judy's perspective. Reoccurring themes, so things like guilt, taboo subjects, voyeurism, they reoccur quite frequently in Hitchcock's work. Heavy use of suspense. He was all about the suspense. He was all about bringing up to the bang, as he called it. And then obviously conveying a sense of mystery. So, areas of comparison. Now, this may be a sort of repeat of one of my older videos, but I'm hoping that this will just give it in a simplistic way that you could use to expand into your own analysis. Okay. Both films feature significant use of female characters. So in Vertigo, women are heavily sexualized for the male gaze, which was a common feature of Hitchcock's work. And in contrast, Alien was originally written gender neutral, which allows Scott to challenge typical notions of being feminine. It could be argued that she is sexualized by the end of the film, but this may not have been Scott's choice. So we talked about Scott having sort of pioneering these female-led stories and how he's quite good at representing female characters. You could argue that the scene at the end where Ripley takes her clothes off is either a scene of vulnerability, which it is, or it could also be argued to be a sexualized scene, that it was there for the male gaze. Many argue that this was decided by the studio rather than Scott himself, okay? So you could argue that that bit was out of his hands, but that could also mean that he didn't necessarily have control over all areas of production, yeah? In terms of Hitchcock, obviously the female characters are heavily sexualized for the male gaze, and you can bring in Laura Mulvey here and talk a little bit about passivity of women in films, okay? Scott and Hitchcock both masterfully tell their stories through visual storytelling. So Hitchcock's background in German Expressionism allowed him to understand the way visual techniques work. So although he made the switch to talkies, he still maintained that level of silent film knowledge that allowed him to create these beautiful spectacles. As has been said before, when you think of Hitchcock's work, you don't necessarily think of dialogue, you think of the visuals. So for example, the stabbing scene in Psycho, or Madeline's body on top of the red roof, or Madeline coming out of the bathroom. So his dialogue sort of becomes secondary with the idea of the German Expressionism. In Alien, dialogue is important in conveying meaning, but Scott still uses long takes, wide-angle and establishing shots to highlight alien atmosphere. And Scott had a background being a comic strip creator, and also was an excellent camera operator in his own words on a recent interview for GQ. He said that he was an excellent camera operator, which obviously is a little bit prideful, but if you're one of the greatest directors of all time, I think you have the opportunity to do that. So visual storytelling is another thing that matches the two of them. Scott's film uses the dangers of AI to create a secondary antagonist in Ash. So it raises these ideas of philosophical questions for the audience and allows him to effectively embed in messages in the film. So embedding the idea of AI being dangerous, or something that can't necessarily be trusted, it isn't the only message that he embeds in the film, because obviously he's quite anti-capitalist, with the messages about Weyland-Yutani and the company and so on. But one of the key messages is the skepticism around AI. For Hitchcock, messages are embedded in Vertigo, but arguably they're quite personal ones, with Hitchcock projecting his guilt and shame into the character of Scotty, which arguably makes the film more akin to the idea of an auteur, because it's very personal to Hitchcock, and therefore he had that level of creative control to embed himself in the film. Okay, so the messages in Vertigo are a little bit more personal than they are about a wider message. You could definitely argue there are wider messages in Vertigo, but then you would get into the issue of whether or not that was intended. Okay, so contextually, Hitchcock's film arrived when women's rights were on a downturn because of the post-war effort to place them back in the home rather than at work. So it meant many female characters in the film are mostly passive, as per Mulvey's theory. So obviously post-World War II, women had gained a lot of jobs during the war. They had taken them from the men, of course, because the men were away fighting. And therefore they started to get this level of independence, buying power and so on. So then when men returned from war, you had this level of pushback from men as they were trying to reassert themselves as dominant in the workplace and at home. So you get that anxiety a little bit in Vertigo when Judy says that she's got to go to work and Scotty says, no, you stay here, I can look after you, or something to that effect. It shows this idea of pushing back against women being in control and instead trying to take that away from them. Okay, which leads on nicely to Alien, because in Scott's film, it was released during second wave feminism, so which occurred in the 60s going into the 70s, with a female protagonist. So it plays into the role of women as warriors and fighters rather than passive objects. She gets on with it like a stereotypical male character would. So you could argue that it's definitely a choice, that there was a choice there to have a female protagonist to empower women. But if you wanted to be really cynical about it, you could also say that Ripley was included in the film cynically because it meant that it may have gained more traction amongst women, and they knew that it would appeal to women because of the second wave feminist movement. They were trying to tap into that market. So either way, you could argue that it was intentional, or you could argue it was a move to get more people involved watching the film. Okay, so that's some of the areas that you could cover for Alien and Vertigo. You don't, like I said, there are so many more areas and so many more things that you could talk about as part of this film and this film comparison. But one thing that I do want to say is that I cannot cover all of it here. This is just some of the basics that you could use in your own work. Please do more reading around. And obviously, this is the only comparison on the two papers, which means you need to use comparative language when looking at them. Hence why I've compared both directors here. Okay? Thank you very much for listening, and I will see you next time.